attacks in the U.S., every American is scared, should be scared of attacks in the United States. What kind of attacks are we looking at? We're looking at human attacks, infrastructure attacks, adverse nations, China. Like, what kind of attacks are we looking at in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a whole spectrum if you open up that big. Obviously, with terrorism, there's two main focuses, right? So, like, Al Qaeda has a multi coordinated attack in the works that they're planning for the US. It was supposed to be for 2025. It sounds like they got their attackers here earlier, so it could happen at any time. They're a little more focused on almost like how they were with the World Trade Center, an economic target, right? We want a target that hits Americans' purse strings, so they blame their government for it. They hurt financially for a long time. Obviously, that had a medical effect, right? So many people had cancers and stuff. They didn't factor that in, but they saw the success of it. So Al Qaeda's thinking that way. Then there's threats from ISIS, right? The different parts of ISIS. It could also be a multi-coordinated attack, but they want to focus mass casualty, right? So it's still a terrorist focus, but it's very different, right? It could be a beach, it could be a theme park, right? It's a little different.
This would they kind of inspire lone wolf?
And they're asking lone wolves, right? They recently just asked lone wolves of all things to attack White House staff and congressional staff. So ISIS put that request out. And then obviously when you say nation states, obviously they do things like cyber attacks, but I think the issue more isn't an attack today. It's what they take control of. So if we have a go to war moment or something, they can shut off our infrastructure or slow us down, right? Or make us unable to respond. I think we should look at an attack in that way. So it's almost like an insider threat because they're in here. I don't know what you call it, but it needs to be something like that.
Really just position themselves for game day. They could just, for example, the weather balloon that flew over. Like I was really disturbed by that. I think a lot of people were. I mean, you have a Chinese weather balloon that leaves China, comes across, and it's just allowed to fly over our bases and stuff like that. Like, am I just a right-wing lunatic that I'm a conspiracy theorist that I'm so concerned about something like that? Or is that a real concern?
Yeah, so they are collecting, right? But the sad part is it's like they're collecting around every major location now, right? In country. So the Chinese collection against our critical infrastructure, what you might call like a war go-to site in the country. Obviously, the control they're taking over in the ports. I mean, that's all very dangerous, but it's like we aren't honest about the impacts that could be.
Could they, like, if this weather balloon's flying over, could they do an EMP, shut down our grid?
I mean, maybe technically, I don't think that's the intent.
Right.
I think the intent was to collect probably on certain locations. And I think it was also just what China likes to do is they like to do an influence, in a passive way, right? So even if they did that and didn't collect much, I mean, look at how the American population viewed it. We viewed it as a weak government. We didn't trust our government, right? And it sows some dissent, and China likes to do that. That's why they amplify, political things we argue about in this country. People think things go viral because Americans care. Well, no, like China or Russia are pulling the strings and making a lot of that go viral, and it's not an accurate portrayal of what everyday Americans feel.
Particularly like TikTok, right?
Yeah,
they can really make things go viral on TikTok if they want to. Our southern border is a very hot topic right now with the election coming up. You got, Kamala Harris with the border czar, and all these numbers are coming out. Like, I've spent the last few years, I've spent a lot of time looking at it and looking particularly at fighting age males, no women, no children coming across, to me, very obvious Chinese militants, people from Syria and Iran coming across the border. How much have you really tracked what's going? I'm sure you have a lot in your job, like of those types of threats coming across the southern border.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, as you said, coming across. I mean, there's multiple reasons why, right? Obviously, there just is more pathways open now, right? Because there's such an illegal movement up through Latin America. Like, those countries down there are giving, in a lot of ways, humanitarian visas to these people, knowing they're not staying in the country and moving to America, right? Like, they're enabling some of this. Like Ecuador, if you're Chinese, you don't even need to get a visa. They know they're going there to come north, right? So one of the big issues is these Latin American countries aren't really operating as allies to us. They're actually like supporting this invasion. And, they joke that Kamala isn't the border czar, but if her job was to deal with the root cause, she has not talked to any of these countries and stopped, right? We have carrots and sticks. We have economic relationships with these countries, and there should be no way people are getting visas to come to America through those countries because of the obligations they have to us on multiple levels. So that's an issue. Another thing that's really important, if you set the large number, I mean, the Chinese thing's a 6,000% increase. That's crazy. But even when it comes,
can you say that again? China's 6,000% increase of
the Chinese males coming across the southern border. I mean, that's a huge number.
Yeah.
But another thing that happened is, so after the Hamas attacks, the terrorists kind of made an assessment. And when I'm talking about terrorists, I'm talking Al-Qaeda, Haqqani network, ISIS, that, the U.S. is going to close the southern border, right? There was this border infiltration into Israel. Americans are going to kind of overcorrect. And so they pushed a bunch of terrorists forward. So those first 3 to 4 months after the Hamas attacks, very large numbers of terrorists came into this country.
Because they thought they had to up the numbers because we'd have a tighter border, but we never did.
Yeah, so this is our chance to get in. We need to get in now. And so a lot got in then. And I feel like people aren't being told that. There's no honesty around it. And then now they're all just positioned, to be a threat.
Well, I mean, if the White House really wanted to stop it, you call a country like Ecuador and say, hey, that annual humanitarian aid that the money we're giving you every year, if you want that to keep coming, you need to put some criteria in place for Chinese people coming to your country, right? Like,
it's a very easy negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, we have, like you said, we have all the carrots and sticks. And what do you think the motivation is there? I guess there's two motivations. One in the White House not to do that. The other is on these South American countries allowing this. What's the motivation there?
I mean, I think part of the motivation is the economic value all these travelers bring, even when they come in for a short period of time. It's a lot of money. Also, what a lot of people forget is some of these movements cost insane money, right? So there's even a movement right now. It goes India to Benghazi to Nicaragua. Private plane the whole way, right? Like, these are very expensive movements too. And so it's not just Southwest airline flights bringing, refugees or migrants or illegals to these countries, right? There's private planes. There's big money behind the terrorist movements and some of these other movements to bring people to our border.
Well, clearly the immigrants can't afford it.
Right.
So who's paying for it? I mean, they always say follow the money, right? So who's behind this? Who's the they? We say they're doing this, they're behind this. Who are the they that's actually paying for this? And what's the incentive for them?
Exactly. I mean, they're saying that if you're being moved by like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and basically if the cartels know you're a terrorist, I mean, it's basically a $10,000 cost just to bring you to the border. But then that didn't include, obviously, your visas, your flights, right? Some of these people are going Iran to Turkey to like Brazil, all the way up. I mean, that's a long process to take care of people, to feed them, to get the visas, et cetera. So yeah, there is big money. I mean, some of these people are coming across our southern border here for economic opportunity. They're spending $10,000 to $20,000 to get in here.
Well, who's footing the bill though for that?
I mean, I know at least for the terrorist side, I mean, terrorist groups are funding the travel of their own people.
Yeah, it's speculatory, but why would the White House not be making every attempt to put a stop to this? I mean, clearly the info you're giving me right now is info that's making its way up through intelligence channels, in briefings, in the Oval Office. So if they're getting the same information, why wouldn't they say, hey, my first and foremost responsibility as Commander-in-Chief, President of the United States, and our administration is to protect American people? Why would they not shut that down?
I think one of the problems you get when we're talking politicians and politics is they're not good at saying I implemented a bad policy or a bad change, right? And they made a change at the border, right? And that opened it up more. And so I think it's not wanting to go back on policy. Even in Libya, so after the fall of Gaddafi, we were supporting the Libyan government that supported Al-Qaeda, right?
Right.
It was pretty clear within the first year Al-Qaeda was involved in the prime minister's office and this and that. But it's so hard for our politicians to say, oh, we made a mistake in policy, we're going to change it or shift like we're seeing in Afghanistan. And they won't do it because they think it'll affect their poll numbers. It'll make them look weak. They don't want to admit a failed policy. So they actually lots of times continue failed policy.
When we're talking about like shutting off the access of information of how to get in the country and people coming in our country, I heard you mention before that even TikTok like gives a full blueprint map of how to get to the United States. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, basically TikTok, like I brought up in Sean's show, it's used like tech, you know?
Right.
You can use it to route yourself. So it can say, take this route or take this highway, or maybe get a boat and go around this because there's law enforcement or whatever in this
Kind of like
area.
Waze, like Waze.
Yeah, it is. It's just
The
like
cop right here.
Waze, criminal elements.
Yeah.
And then it has all those extra things like, oh, if you need medical care, go here. You know, if you need food, shelter, clothing. And so, like, the whole time you come up through Latin America, you have these safety nets. So it actually makes you more comfortable doing it too. And it increases the number of people coming, right? Because, oh, the route's safer than it was.
Right. So many things I got to ask on this. So, I mean, you got human trafficking, sex trafficking, fentanyl, and all the drugs come across the border. But because of your background, I want to talk specifically about potential terrorist folks being in the United States. How many do you think in the last 3 years has made it into the United States? If you had to put just a guess number of how many military fighting age males that potentially terrorists in the United States that made it through in the last 3 years.
I think 1,500 approximately.
50 and those, I guess, what type of threat would that be? What are they capable of? How are they dispersing themselves? How would they position themselves for attack? What kind of attack would we be in threat of?
Well, first, when you talk about skills, right, there's different levels. So there's terrorists who've been terrorists for decades. They fought like in Iraq, et cetera. Those ones are very concerning, right? Because they are hardened. They also have an emotional issue, right?
Sure.
They lost their brothers in arms in Iraq, right? They're a little more motivated. Then you have what would be like the new trainees and new recruits, right? Some have no training, like you might be ISIS follower and have zero training, right? They don't even care if you have training. And then Al-Qaeda, at least, you know, Al-Qaeda has a lot of training camps going on right now. Two of the key ones that are concerning is obviously suicide bomber training camps. They have 8 affiliated ones in Afghanistan right now. And then they actually have urban warfare training, which is kind of the similar skills we saw of the Hamas attacks, right? So those, I think, is the concerning part, right? Because Americans aren't used to suicide bombings per se or urban warfare attacks, right? So I think that's what we have to get our mind around. These terrorists are trained in ways that, yes, our soldiers seen, but everyday Americans don't have any concept of the capabilities and what they're willing to do.
Even our police forces.
Oh, they don't have the training. They haven't seen it, right? And so we need to really be diverting funds to get them the appropriate training, right? We don't want to leave communities at a disadvantage.
So if you have, 1,500 of these guys in the United States, they're waiting. Are they waiting to be triggered? How would something like that play out? Is there just staging, waiting for the right moment to be triggered to launch an attack?
What I at least know about the Al-Qaeda attack, because remember, there's multiple threats.
Sure.
Even with an Al-Qaeda, there's multiple threats. Right. But the main big coordinated Al-Qaeda attack is none of the actual attackers know the target. They didn't want them to get caught up, like in secondary or something like that, or in questioning. So they'll be given the targets last minute. And that's it'll be in the urban warfare type of environment. So they don't have to do any extra training. They're trained to do what they need to do, if that makes sense.
By.
Yeah. Now, ISIS is a little different. They put out things, like weekly almost, right? Mm-hmm. Target transportation, whatever they ask. There's been a lot, obviously, for the Paris Olympics, right?
Sure.
Do knife attacks, do vehicle rammings. You can't do that. Do an attack with a drone, right? Yeah. So, it really just depends on who's targeting it. And then there's all the others.
Yeah.
So, we have terrorists that came here from the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, right? Mm-hmm. IMU. You worked in Pakistan. I mean, we don't have IMU terrorists in United States, right? Like, what are they intending to do? So there's a lot of other terrorist groups here now that really weren't here prior.
Right.
I know for years, Hezbollah's had a lot of businesses and front companies, and they make a lot of money in the United States, right? But I don't think people have thought through, okay, now what if there's trained attackers here? And there's a lot of things we have to prepare for in that case, just because these groups are a different level than petty street crime in the U.S., even murders in the U.S.
Right. So I want to use what we just talked about to speak to the audience a little bit, because I don't ever want the show just to be entertain people, right? What could the audience do on a personal level? I mean, they don't work in the White House. What could they do on a personal level to prepare for something like this?
I really think it's just the preparedness you would do for anything, right? I
Yeah.
live in Florida, so there's a lot of things you do around hurricanes, right? There's family emergency plans, right?
Hmm.
And then there's plans, like a lot of people make a family emergency plan and then like the father has all the roles. It's like, well, let's
Yeah.
assume he's also at work and we make a second plan,
Yes.
right? I think another thing that Americans really could do that's so easy and they forget to do is just basic first aid training, right?
Hmm.
Even for your kids, right? So you can respond, if a situation happens. Another thing is, I mean, if you're really concerned, I think it's important to like understand if your law enforcement is aware of the terrorist threats. Like, I've been to police departments and they don't get anything passed down to them related to terrorism at all, right? Some have said, we've never worked a terrorism case, right? They're getting tips at times and like, well, we can't work this. This is terrorism, right? So I think on the community level too, it's kind of like, what are we trained on? What is law enforcement's role and whose job is it to respond? I was talking about this recently, with Scott Mann. If you go to like the DHS See Something, Say Something page, you can give terrorism tips. Well, depending on where you live, so if you live in Florida, you click Florida, and then it is by region, right? So I'm Tampa, Central Florida. And when I click it, it says I need to go to the Tampa Emergency Management Office is where I give a terrorism tip. That's the office that handles hurricanes. Obviously, if I send them a terrorism tip, they're not going to work it, right? So that needs to be fixed. So we need to be a little more engaged in where these things are being worked and who's responsible for them. Because, we make the joke, no one's coming for you. At the community level, you need to do your best to prepare. And you need to make sure not just your police department's doing drills, but, if you have a church, your kid's school, et cetera, like they need to all be prepared.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when Columbine happened, all the police departments started training for active shooter scenarios. And,
Mm-hmm.
but now today, the only people, I think it stops at like the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. And then it doesn't, like you said, doesn't make its way down. And but I mean, on a practical level, like you said, churches and places that are going to be soft targets, terrorists like soft targets, where there's a lot of people, churches, schools, things like that. Those are at individual levels that the church elder boards could be putting together their security team and talking about stuff like this, and so should the schools. What level? At what level do you think every American has a responsibility to speak up on these things, to speak up and raise concerns in their communities and to their representatives, their state and federal representatives?
Well, I think everyone has a role because after the fact, if you said, oh, I saw this
Yeah.
problem, I saw this issue, but I didn't make the effort to bring it up, well, then you're part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
All of these people are in their job to work for you, right? And so if you're giving them stuff to do and they're not working for you, it also gives you a reason to vote them out,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's a way to make your community safer. So I do think people need to take more ownership of it. We had a lot of ownership of it after 9/11, and then it's kind of like fallen off the wayside.
Yeah.
People are back to, oh, I don't want to get involved again, or
Yeah.
even people don't want to. They might get charged if they
Yeah.
they try to help someone in a situation. So yeah, it's almost like we have to shift back again.
Yeah.
And remember, this is your community, right? If you let something happen to your community, it hurts everyone. It hurts the entire resiliency of your community, and that has lasting effects.
Yeah. Absolutely.